In the spring of 2017, a small wooden crate was carried into a stretch of restored pine forest west of Tallahassee, Florida. Inside that crate were 12 snakes, not pythons, not anything anyone in the area had seen in decades. These were eastern indigo snakes, glossy, blue-black, almost 7 feet long, and they were about to be set loose into the wild for the first time in that part of the state in over 50 years. To most people watching, it looked like madness. Florida already had a snake problem. The state was drowning in invasive Burmese pythons, animals so large and so destructive that wildlife agencies were paying hunters by the foot to kill them. So when word got out that conservationists were now releasing even more snakes into the wild on purpose, funded by taxpayer dollars and donor money, the reaction was exactly what you would expect. People laughed. People mocked it online. Late-night hosts joked about it. Hunters who had spent years wrestling 12-foot pythons out of canals shook their heads at the idea that anyone thought adding snakes was the solution to a snake problem. It sounded like throwing gasoline on a fire and calling it a fire suppression strategy. But the scientists behind that crate were not improvising. They had spent nearly 4 decades preparing for that exact moment, and what happened in the years that followed turned a punchline into one of the most quietly successful predator reintroduction stories in North America. To understand why anyone thought releasing snakes was a good idea, you have to go back further than 2017. You have to go back to the actual root of Florida's snake crisis, which did not start with a government program at all. It started with the exotic pet trade. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s, Burmese pythons, native to the swamps and grasslands of Southeast Asia, began showing up for sale across the United States as exotic pets. They were cheap, they were dramatic looking, and as hatchlings they were small enough to fit in a shoebox. The problem is that a Burmese python does not stay small. Within a few years, a python bought as an 18-inch baby can grow past 12 feet and weigh well over 100 pounds. Most pet owners had no idea what they were signing up for. Enclosures that worked for a juvenile snake became hopelessly inadequate. Feeding bills became enormous, and a startling number of owners did the unthinkable. They drove out to the edge of the Everglades and let the snake go. For a long time, this was treated as an isolated nuisance, a handful of escaped pets that might survive a season or two before dying in a cold snap. Florida's climate proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. South Florida's subtropical wetlands turned out to be close enough to the python's native South Florida as high as 100,000 or more. Nobody has an exact count, and that uncertainty is itself part of the horror story because Burmese pythons are masters of camouflage. A 12-foot snake can lie completely still in 2 feet of grass and become functionally invisible. Researchers eventually figured out that for every python a survey team manages to find and remove, there are likely dozens more in the same area that go completely undetected. The ecological toll has been staggering, and this is not exaggeration for dramatic effect. This is documented field science. Researchers conducting nighttime road surveys in areas with heavy python presence found that populations of raccoons, opossums, and bobcats had collapsed by anywhere from 87 to 99% compared to areas without pythons. Marsh rabbits, once one of the most common small mammals in the Everglades, became locally almost extinct in core python territory. White-tailed deer fawns, once thought far too large for a snake to bother with, started turning up in python stomach content analyses with disturbing regularity. Necropsies on captured pythons have found whole adult deer, wading birds, including the federally endangered wood stork, and in some of the most jaw-dropping cases, full-grown alligators. A picture that circulated widely a few years back showed a python that had attempted to swallow an alligator, and both animals died in the standoff, the python's body literally rupturing under the strain. That image, as gruesome as it is, captured something important about the scale of what Florida was dealing with. This was not a predator slotting quietly into the existing food web. This was an apex predator with essentially no natural check on its population, eating its way through the base of an entire ecosystem. Florida's response evolved over nearly 2 decades, and most of what the public actually saw and heard about was the hunting side of the fight. The state created the Python Elimination Program, paying registered hunters by the hour and by the foot for captured snakes, with bonuses for the largest specimens and for snakes guarding nests of eggs. Every year now, Florida runs the Florida Python Challenge, a competition that draws hundreds of participants from across the country, all competing for cash prizes by removing as many pythons as possible from public lands in a single window of time. These events generate huge media attention, and they do remove real snakes from the... This is where the more scientific side of python control comes in, and it is genuinely one of the more clever pieces of applied wildlife biology happening anywhere in the world right now. In 2013, a wildlife biologist named Ian Bartoszek, working with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, started a program that flips the python's own biology into a weapon against itself. The idea is called the scout snake method. Researchers capture adult male Burmese pythons, surgically implant a small radio transmitter into the snake's body cavity, and then release that same male back into the exact spot where he was caught. From that point on, the team tracks him using old-fashioned radio telemetry, the same general technology used since World War II, walking through the brush with handheld antennas, listening for the beeping signal that gets stronger as they close in. Here is the clever part. Male Burmese pythons, like males of a lot of species, are extremely motivated to find females during breeding season, which runs primarily from December through April and tends to peak around February. A tagged male python will travel for miles, sometimes crossing canals, roads, and dense terrain that would take a human search team days to cover, all in pursuit of a reproductively active female. The radio caller effectively turns him into a guide dog. Researchers let him do the searching, and when his movement pattern indicates he has found a mate, the team moves in. And instead of removing just one snake, they often find 2, 3, sometimes more pythons tangled together in a mating aggregation. Crucially, they prioritize removing the females because a single adult female python can lay between 30 and over 100 eggs in a clutch. Removing one large breeding female before she lays that clutch can prevent dozens of future pythons from ever entering the population. The male scout, meanwhile, gets released again to keep doing his job, season after season, sometimes for years. The results of this program, just from this one organization working a single corner of southwest Florida, have been remarkable. As of the most recent reporting in 2026, the Conservancy of Southwest Florida and its research partners have removed more than 53,000 pounds of python and more than 25,000 python eggs from an area of roughly 200 square miles outside Naples. That is over 26.5 tons of invasive snake taken out of the ecosystem since the program began. In just the most recent breeding season, between November of 2025 and April of 2026, the team pulled 170. 7 pythons weighing over 8,000 pounds combined out of that same stretch of land, along with more than 4,100 eggs that will now never hatch. The program currently maintains a working roster of around 40 radio-tagged male scouts at any given time, and individual snakes have become something close to local celebrities among the research team. One scout named Elvis became known as the program's most productive tracker, repeatedly leading biologists to large breeding females year after year. Another scout, Loki, worked the program for 6 years before he died. And the biologists who worked with him have spoken candidly about feeling a real connection to these animals, despite knowing their entire purpose is to help eliminate an invasive species. There is something almost paradoxical and very human about that, using one python's instincts, season after season, to help erase the damage his own species has done. The biologists are clear-eyed about what this program can and cannot achieve. Ian Bartoszek, who has led the radio telemetry project from the beginning, has said publicly that the team does not believe they are winning an outright war against the python, not in the sense of eliminating the species from Florida entirely. With an established population spread across thousands of square miles of nearly impenetrable wetland, full eradication is not considered realistically achievable with current technology. What the scout snake method does appear to be accomplishing is suppression, slowing the rate of reproduction in the areas where the program operates intensively, and giving native wildlife at least a fighting chance to recover in those zones. There have even been encouraging signs that the long-term pressure is working, with researchers noting that in some of the areas where scout snakes have operated the longest, the tagged males are taking longer to find mates, or the females they do find tend to be smaller, both of which can indicate that the local breeding population is feeling the strain of over a decade of sustained removal. So that is one half of Florida's snake story, the hunting and tracking side, the part that gets the headlines about giant pythons and record-breaking removal seasons. But there is a second half to this story, and it is the part that actually connects to where this whole video started, with conservationists releasing snakes into the wild on purpose and getting mocked for it. That part of the story is not about pythons at all. It is about a native snake that Florida had almost entirely lost and the long, patient effort to bring it back. The eastern indigo snake is, by most measures, one of the more remarkable reptiles native to North America. It is the longest native snake on the continent, with adult males commonly reaching 7 to 9 feet in length. Its scales have an iridescent, almost blue-black sheen that can look genuinely purple when the light hits it, correctly, with a contrasting splash of orange-red coloring along the chin and throat. Unlike the invasive python, the indigo snake is completely non-venomous, and, by every account from biologists who handle them regularly, remarkably docile toward humans. What makes the indigo snake ecologically important is its diet and its role as what scientists call an apex predator within its native range. Indigo snakes are not picky eaters. They consume a wide variety of prey, including small mammals, birds, frogs, and crucially, other snakes, including venomous species like rattlesnakes and copperheads, which the indigo snake is largely immune to or simply overpowers before the venom becomes a problem. In a healthy longleaf pine forest ecosystem, the presence of indigo snakes historically helped keep populations of smaller predators and venomous snakes in balance, which in turn shaped the entire structure of who eats whom throughout that habitat. The problem is that the eastern indigo snake nearly disappeared from large parts of its historic range, and the reasons why are almost entirely about habitat, not about any direct conflict with humans. Indigo snakes evolved alongside the longleaf pine forests and sandy upland habitats of the southeastern United States, an ecosystem that once stretched across roughly 90 million acres from Virginia, down through Florida, and west into Texas. Over the course of the 20th century, that ecosystem was reduced by logging, agriculture, and development to less than 3% of its original extent. As the forest disappeared, so did the gopher tortoise, a species indigo snakes depend on in a way that surprises a lot of people. Gopher tortoises dig long, deep burrows in sandy soil, some extending over 30 feet, and these burrows maintain a remarkably stable temperature and humidity year-round. Indigo snakes use these tortoise burrows as essential winter shelter, retreating into them during cold snaps, and often returning to the very same burrow year after year. When gopher tortoise populations crashed due to habitat loss and, for a long stretch of history, legal harvesting for food, the indigo snakes lost their shelter along with their hunting grounds. By the time the eastern indigo snake was formally listed as a federally threatened species. In 1978, it had already vanished from huge stretches of North Florida, southern Alabama, and Mississippi, surviving in any meaningful numbers only in pockets of central and south Florida, where the climate stayed warm enough that they did not need deep burrow shelter to survive winter. For decades after that listing, the indigo snake's recovery looked bleak, largely because you cannot just release a threatened species back into a landscape that no longer has the habitat to support it. This is the part of the story that the clickbait headlines tend to skip entirely, because it is not as dramatic as a single triumphant snake release video, but it is the actual reason this program eventually succeeded. The Nature Conservancy spent 35 years, starting well before any snake was ever reintroduced, restoring a property in the Florida Panhandle called the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, rebound on their own because the open, sunny, sandy conditions tortoises need were finally being restored. By the time biologists looked at the preserve again in the 2010s, they realized something significant. The forest had been repaired. The tortoise burrows were back. The only piece missing from the picture was the indigo snake itself. That is what set the stage for 2017, the year that first crate of 12 indigo snakes was driven out to the preserve and released. The breeding and rearing side of this effort runs through a facility called the Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, founded by a conservation nonprofit called the Orion Society in 2012, and operated since 2014 by the Central Florida Zoo and Botanical Gardens in Sanford, Florida. It remains the only captive breeding facility in existence dedicated specifically to producing eastern indigo snakes for the sole purpose of reintroducing their offspring into the wild. The process is slow and deliberate by design. Snakes hatch and spend their first year of life at the Orion Center's breeding facility. After that first year, many of them are transferred to a second facility, the Willaca National Fish Hatchery, where they spend an additional year being prepared for release. Only after 2 full years of careful rearing are the young snakes considered ready to be set loose into the restored habitat. The whole pipeline depends on a genuinely large coalition of partners working together, including the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Zoo Atlanta, the United States Forest Service, Auburn University, and several other wildlife organizations, all coordinating to keep this multi-year breeding and release cycle running every single year. The program operates at 2 primary release sites. The first is the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle, where the very first release happened in 2017. The second is the Conecuh National Forest in southern Alabama, where releases actually began even earlier, stretching back to 2010. The Alabama site has been running long enough now that it offers a preview of what success looks like over a longer timeline. As of recent counts, the program has reintroduced 244 eastern indigo snakes to the Conecuh National Forest alone since that site's releases began. A biologist working with the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources made an observation that captures exactly why this entire reintroduction effort matters ecologically. In the years before, indigo snakes were present in meaningful numbers. Copperhead populations in that same forest had noticeably increased. Once indigo snakes were reestablished, that imbalance began to correct itself, because the indigo snake's diet naturally includes other snakes, and its presence helps regulate populations of smaller predators that, left unchecked, can throw an entire local food web out of balance. That is the ecological logic behind the entire program in a single, concrete example. Remove an apex predator from a system for long enough, and the species below it in the food chain do not just sit quietly waiting for it to come back. They expand to fill the gap, and that expansion has consequences that ripple outward. Back at the Florida site, the releases have continued every year since 2017, and the most recent numbers show just how far the program has grown. In the spring of 2025, the team released 42 eastern indigo snakes at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, the largest single release event at that location since the program began, made up of 22 females and 20 males. That release brought the cumulative total of snakes reintroduced to that one Florida preserve to 209. The following spring, in late April and early May of 2026, the partners released another 42 juvenile snakes split between the two sites, 21 released at the Florida Preserve on April 28th, and 21 released in the Alabama Forest on May 8th. That Florida release marked the 10th consecutive annual release at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve since the program's founding in 2017, nearly a decade of uninterrupted methodical work. Across both release sites combined, the Florida and Alabama programs together have now returned somewhere close to 500 eastern indigo snakes to landscapes where the species had been functionally absent for generations. Numbers alone do not prove a reintroduction program is working, though, and the scientists running this effort have been careful never to declare premature victory. Releasing a captive bred snake into the wild is only step one. The real test of success is whether those snakes survive long-term, established territories, and most importantly, reproduce on their own without any further human help. This is exactly the milestone that turned skepticism about the program into something closer to validation. In 2023, field researchers monitoring the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve documented the first confirmed wild-born hatchlings descended from previously released captive-bred parent snakes. For a reintroduction program, this is the single most meaningful data point there is. It is the difference between simply stocking an area with animals that will eventually die out and actually reestablishing a self-sustaining wild population. A snake that was born in the wild, to parents that were also released into the wild, free of any human intervention in its conception or birth, is proof that the ecosystem itself has recovered enough to support the species independently again. Confirming that wild reproduction is happening, and that it continues happening, is an enormous amount of unglamorous patient work. And it is worth describing because it is so far removed from the cartoonish image of snakes being unleashed to do battle with pythons that clickbait videos tend to imply. Field teams at the Apalachicola Preserve set up motion-triggered camera traps at known gopher tortoise burrow, entrances and along drift fences that funnel wildlife movement between different habitat zones across the property. Volunteers and staff then spend enormous amounts of time reviewing the footage these cameras generate, often hundreds of thousands of individual photographs across a season, looking for any glimpse of an indigo snake entering or leaving a burrow. This painstaking review process lets researchers track which approach directly, explaining that every single release adds another layer of critical data that helps the team understand how the snakes are adapting, surviving, and reproducing in the wild, and that over time, that accumulated information is what transforms a reintroduction effort from a hopeful experiment into an actual self-sustaining population recovery. There is also an important and often misunderstood connection between this indigo snake story and Florida's python crisis, and getting this connection right matters, because exaggerating it is exactly how a real conservation success story turns into a misleading internet headline. Eastern indigo snakes are not being deployed as some kind of trained python hunting squad. Nobody is releasing indigo snakes into the deep. Snakes for the same prey base, particularly the small and medium-sized mammals that both species rely on. In areas where pythons have devastated local mammal populations, indigo snakes simply have less to eat, which makes recovery harder. That said, the relationship is not purely one-directional. Researchers tracking python nests as part of the Scout Snake program have documented at least one case of an endangered eastern indigo snake preying on a hatchling Burmese python that the team had been monitoring. A small but symbolically powerful moment that field biologists have described as feeling like a genuine win for native wildlife. A sign, as one researcher put it, of the Everglades fighting back. It is a real data point, but it is one documented predation event involving a hatchling, not evidence of indigo snakes meaningfully suppressing the adult python population at any kind of scale. The honest picture is that these are two separate conservation efforts, one focused on removing a destructive invasive species through scientific tracking and targeted removal, and the other focused on rebuilding a native predator that habitat loss had nearly erased, and both efforts are aimed at the same underlying goal, which is restoring some version of ecological balance to a part of the country where human activity spent the better part of a century quietly dismantling it. What makes this whole story worth telling is not really about snakes at all when you step back from it. It is about the gap between how complicated, slow-moving conservation science actually works and how that work gets compressed and distorted once it reaches the internet. A headline promising that Florida released hundreds of snake killers and shocked the world makes for a great thumbnail, but it skips over 35 years of habitat restoration before a single snake was ever released. It skips over the breeding facility that has operated continuously since 2012, the second hatchery that gives young snakes an extra year to mature before release, the camera traps and the hundreds of thousands of photographs reviewed by hand, and the decade of patient, mostly invisible field work required before anyone could responsibly say a population was starting to sustain itself. It also tends to wildly overstate the role these snakes play against pythons, when the far more significant and measurable progress against the python invasion is actually happening through an entirely different program of the radiotelemetry scout snake method, where Burmese pythons themselves are being turned into the tool that finds and removes their own species, season after season, mating aggregation after mating aggregation, egg clutch after egg clutch. Both of these efforts, the python suppression program and the indigo snake reintroduction program, share the same underlying lesson, even though they involve opposite kinds of snakes pursuing opposite goals. Neither one is a quick fix, neither one promised instant results, and neither one delivered the kind of dramatic, single-moment victory that a clickbait title implies. What they actually delivered was incremental, evidence-based progress, measured in tons of python, removed from a defined search area year after year, and in wild hatchling counts confirmed through painstaking camera trap review at a single preserve in the Florida Panhandle. The people who mocked the idea of releasing snakes back in 2017 were reacting to a single decontextualized image, snakes being released into a state already overwhelmed by snakes, without any of the decades of restoration work that made that release scientifically sound in the first place. Once you actually follow the full timeline, from the slow recovery of a long-leaf pine forest, to the careful 2-year rearing process for every single indigo snake hatchling, to the first confirmed wild birth in 2023, to the 10th consecutive annual release reaching the Florida Preserve in 2026, the story stops looking like a punchline and starts looking like exactly what it is, a rare example of a threatened species reintroduction program that is actually carefully, measurably working.